The dust settled over the small, sun-baked town of Redemption, a name ironically bestowed upon a place where redemption was a rare commodity. Elias Blackwood, a man forged by the unforgiving plains and the brutal echoes of the Civil War, stood with his shoulders slumped. His face, a roadmap of past struggles, bore a fresh bruise blooming beneath his left eye. It was Silas's handiwork, as it always was. Silas, his brother-in-law, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his bitter resentment. "Useless," Silas spat, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of a decade of disappointment. "A barren mule is worth more than you." Elias said nothing. He had long ago learned that words were only kindling for Silas's fire. The reason for Silas's rage was a decade-old truth. Elias was sterile. A doctor in a dusty tent clinic after a battlefield injury had delivered the diagnosis with the cold finality of a death sentence. It was a secret Elias had carried like a lead weight, and when he married Silas's sister Clara, it became the foundation of his humiliation. Clara, fragile and yearning for a family, had eventually succumbed to consumption, her last days filled with quiet despair. Silas, however, had never let Elias forget. He saw Elias not as a grieving husband, but as the thief of his sister's joy, the reason their family line was a dead end. Elias's days were a monotonous cycle of labor and beatings. He toiled on Silas's small ranch, his calloused hands repairing fences, mending tools, and tending to the meager herd of cattle. He was a beast of burden, a silent servant enduring a slow, painful existence. The townsfolk of Redemption mostly looked away. They knew of Silas's temper and Elias's quiet suffering, but in a world where survival was a daily battle, no one had the luxury of interfering in another man's misery. The only sanctuary Elias found was the empty bunkhouse, a shack a short walk from the main cabin. Inside, the scent of leather and dust clung to the air, and a single oil lamp cast long dancing shadows on the walls. It was here, in the quiet darkness, that he could finally breathe. He would trace the outline of a faded photograph of Clara, her smile a ghost of a happier time. He missed her fiercely, and the guilt of his inability to give her a child gnawed at him constantly, echoing Silas's cruel words. One hot afternoon, as the sun beat down on the parched earth, a strange sight appeared on the horizon. A stagecoach, an infrequent visitor to Redemption, rumbled into town, kicking up a cloud of ochre dust. A woman, dressed in a simple but well-kept traveling dress, stepped down. She was not the usual hardened frontierswoman. Her hair was a warm auburn, and her eyes, though weary from the journey, held a quiet strength. This was Eleanor Vance, a widow from the East Coast, answering an advertisement Silas had placed in a city newspaper. The ad, a fabrication of a respectable, prosperous rancher seeking a wife, was a last-ditch effort to find a woman who could provide him with an heir. Elias watched from the shadows of the livery stable as Silas, his face scrubbed clean, and his demeanor a sickeningly polite facade, greeted her. Elias felt a knot tighten in his gut. He knew this woman was walking into a trap, a gilded cage built of lies. He wanted to warn her, to tell her to turn back, but he knew any such attempt would be met with a swift and brutal reprisal from Silas. He was just the hired hand, the silent dog at the master's heel. Silas, with a grand gesture, ushered Eleanor towards the main cabin, his voice dripping with feigned charm. "Welcome to Redemption, my dear. I am Silas Blackwood. It's an honor to have you." Eleanor offered a polite, practiced smile. Her gaze, however, was not on Silas. It drifted over the desolate landscape, the broken fences, the skeletal cattle, and finally landed on Elias. Her eyes, filled with a sharp, intelligent curiosity, took in his bruised face, his worn-out clothes, and the defeated slump of his shoulders. She didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze for a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement that she saw something more than the man Silas presented. In that fleeting moment, an unasked question passed between them. a flicker of understanding in the vast, lonely expanse of the West. Elias's heart, a muscle that had long forgotten how to hope, gave a faint, unexpected tremor. Eleanor's arrival marked a subtle but profound shift in the dynamics of the Blackwood Ranch. She was not the delicate, naive woman Silas had hoped for. She was a widow, a survivor of a different kind of hardship, one that had tempered her with a steel-like resilience. She observed everything with a quiet intensity, her hands busy with mending and her mind constantly calculating. She quickly saw through Silas's charade. The prosperous ranch was a failing enterprise, and Silas's chivalry was a thin veneer over a core of malevolent ambition. Most importantly, she saw Elias. She saw the way his shoulders flinched when Silas entered a room, the way his eyes held a deep, unyielding sadness. One evening she found him by the well, his back turned, quietly wincing as he stretched. A dark bruise, the size of a man's fist, was visible on his side. "That's a nasty fall," she said softly, her voice surprising him. Elias froze. He quickly pulled his shirt down, trying to hide the mark. "Just a stumble. Nothing to worry about." Eleanor didn't press him. She simply offered him a clean rag and a small bottle of antiseptic she carried in her satchel. "Clean it. Infection is a wicked thing out here." She didn't ask, she instructed. Her tone was not one of pity, but of practical, no-nonsense care. From that day on, a silent, unspoken understanding grew between them. Eleanor would leave a plate of food for Elias in the bunkhouse, a little more than the meager portions Silas rationed for him. She would mend the holes in his worn-out clothes, leaving them on the porch for him to find. She never spoke of Silas's cruelty, but her actions spoke volumes. She was a woman who didn't waste words on platitudes. She offered help through action. Silas, preoccupied with the illusion of his new life, was initially oblivious to the subtle rebellion taking place under his nose. He was too busy boasting to the few neighbors about his beautiful new wife and how she would surely bless him with a son. The thought of a son, a legacy he craved above all else, was the only thing that kept his rage at bay. He had no inkling that his new bride was more interested in the silent, bruised man in the bunkhouse than in his blustering showmanship. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in, a torrent of rain and wind that rattled the windows of the cabin. A loose shutter slammed against the side of the house, threatening to rip free. Silas, who had been drinking heavily, refused to go out in the rain. "Let the wind take it," he grumbled, pulling the blanket over his head. Eleanor looked to the door, her eyes meeting Elias's. Elias, without a word, grabbed a hammer and a handful of nails. Eleanor lit a lantern for him, holding it steady as he fought against the gale, the rain lashing at his face, to secure the shutter. He worked with a fierce determination, the rhythm of his hammering a defiant beat against the storm. Eleanor stood in the doorway, the light from the lantern casting a soft glow on his determined face, a silent guardian in the tempest. When he returned, soaked to the bone, Eleanor was waiting for him. She had a cup of hot coffee in her hand and a clean, dry towel. "You'll catch a chill," she said, handing them to him. Elias's hands, trembling from cold and exhaustion, reached for the mug. Their fingers brushed, and a spark, fleeting but undeniable, passed between them. It wasn't a spark of passion, not yet. It was something deeper, a recognition of shared hardship and a burgeoning respect. It was in that moment, in the warmth of the coffee and the quiet kindness of her gaze, that Elias felt a stirring of something he had long believed was dead: hope. The town of Redemption was small, and secrets were hard to keep. Word of Silas's mail-order bride and his grand plans for a family spread like wildfire. The town doctor, an old man named Dr. Alistair, was one of the few who knew the truth about Elias. He had been the one to deliver the diagnosis years ago. Dr. Alistair saw Eleanor when she visited his office for some herbal remedies. He observed her sharp mind and her kind but guarded demeanor. He saw her for what she was, a woman of quiet fortitude. Eleanor, sensing an ally, found a moment to speak to him alone. "Doctor," she began, her voice low. "Silas, he has a cruel streak." Dr. Alistair nodded slowly. "Some men are born with a bitter seed in their hearts, ma'am. Silas's runs deep." He paused, a gentle sadness in his eyes. "He blames your future husband for his sister's unhappiness and for his lack of an heir." Eleanor's brows furrowed. "He told me Elias was a good-for-nothing drifter he took in, out of charity." "That's not the truth of it," Dr. Alistair said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Elias was married to Silas's sister, Clara, a kind, gentle woman. They wanted a family more than anything." He looked at Eleanor, his gaze direct. "But Elias, he cannot have children. It's a wound from a war injury. He told me he took the beatings for it. For her." He gestured vaguely towards Silas's ranch. "Silas blames him. For everything." Eleanor's heart ached with a deep, silent understanding. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, the bruises, the humiliation, the way Elias bore his suffering with a weary acceptance. The truth was far worse than she had imagined. Elias wasn't a victim of random cruelty. He was the scapegoat for a man's broken dreams and a past he couldn't change. That night, Elias was sitting outside the bunkhouse, mending a saddle. The moonlight cast a pale glow on his hands. Eleanor approached him, her steps silent on the packed earth. She held a cup of whiskey, a small gesture of solidarity. She sat beside him on an old wooden crate, the silence stretching between them. "I spoke to the doctor today," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me about Clara." Elias stiffened. He expected her to recoil, to see him as the sterile failure Silas had painted him to be. He waited for the pity, or worse, the disgust, but she offered neither. "He told me about you," she continued, her gaze fixed on the moon. "He told me you can't have children." Elias's head bowed. He couldn't meet her eyes. "It's the truth," he said, his voice raw. "Silas is right. I failed her. I failed him." Eleanor gently took his hand, her touch surprisingly firm. "Elias," she said, her voice filled with a quiet authority, "a man's worth is not measured by the number of children he can father. It is measured by his character, by his kindness, by how he faces a beating and still finds the will to keep on fighting." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "Silas is not a good man. You are." Tears welled in Elias's eyes, hot and sharp. No one, not since Clara, had spoken to him with such kindness, such a complete and total lack of judgment. He had taken the beatings, the humiliation, the years of silent suffering. But it was this simple act of understanding, this single moment of human connection, that finally broke him. He wept, not in sorrow, but in a profound, overwhelming relief. Eleanor didn't move. She simply sat with him, holding his hand as he wept, a silent, unmoving pillar of support under the vast, uncaring sky. She knew in that moment that her purpose in redemption was not to find a husband in Silas, but to save a man who had lost all hope. Eleanor's quiet compassion had not gone unnoticed by Silas. He saw the glances between them, the shared moments of silence, and a green-eyed monster began to stir within him. His control over Elias had always been absolute. Elias was his possession, his living, breathing punching bag. Eleanor's presence, her subtle defiance, and her growing bond with Elias was a threat to his absolute authority. He began to escalate his cruelty. He would find new ways to humiliate Elias, to prove to Eleanor that Elias was nothing more than a broken man. He rationed his food even further, assigning him the most back-breaking tasks in the sweltering heat. He would speak of Elias in front of Eleanor as if he were an animal, a useless dog he had foolishly kept around. One afternoon, Silas cornered Elias in the barn. "I see the way she looks at you," Silas sneered, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Don't get any ideas, Elias. She's mine. She's going to give me a son, and you'll still be what you've always been, nothing." He raised his hand to strike Elias, but a voice from the doorway stopped him. "What are you doing, Silas?" It was Eleanor. Her face was pale, but her eyes were like flint. Silas dropped his hand, his feigned charm returning. "Just having a talk with the boy. He's a bit slow sometimes." "I see," Eleanor said, her voice ice-cold. "Well, I need him to fetch water. Now." She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and walked away. Silas stood in the barn, his face a mask of fury. Elias, for the first time in years, felt a surge of defiance. He had someone in his corner, someone who was not afraid of Silas's rage. That evening, Eleanor confronted Silas directly. She had long given up on the pretense of a happy marriage. "I'm not going to be your wife, Silas," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I came here for a husband, but I will not marry a man who treats another human being like an animal." Silas's face contorted with rage. "You came here because you were a desperate, lonely widow. You'll do what I tell you, or you'll find yourself back on the streets where you belong." "I've survived worse than you, Silas," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've buried a husband. I've seen things you can't imagine. I will not be your puppet, and I will not watch you beat a good man simply because you're a coward." The fight was a brutal verbal brawl. Eleanor's words were a volley of truth, each one a direct hit on Silas's fragile ego. He had never met a woman who spoke to him in such a way. She was not afraid of his bluster, his threats, or his violence. Finally, he stormed out of the cabin, the slamming of the door echoing the end of their pretense. Elias, hearing the commotion, waited until Silas was gone. He walked back to the cabin, finding Eleanor sitting at the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He'll be back," Elias said, his voice full of a weary certainty. "He won't let you go." Eleanor looked up, her gaze steady. "I know. We have to leave." Elias shook his head. "We can't. He has everything. He'd find us." Eleanor stood up and walked to the door of the bunkhouse. She stood there for a moment, the lamplight casting her in a soft glow. "You have to help me, Elias. I can't stay here. I have nothing, and you have nothing, but together we can have a future. We have to. You need me in your bed." The words hung in the air between them, not as a seductive whisper, but as a statement of fact, a desperate plea for survival. She wasn't asking for romance. She was proposing a partnership, a union of two lost souls against a cruel world. The shock of her directness was a cold splash of water on Elias's face. He finally understood. This was not about love. Not yet. This was about rescue. They were two broken halves of a whole, and together they had a chance. The words, "You need me in your bed," were not an invitation to a torrid romance. They were a strategic proposal, a statement of shared need. Elias needed a reason to fight back, and Eleanor needed a protector. Their escape plan began to take shape, born from shared whispers under the cover of night. They would have to be meticulous. Silas was a brute, but he was also cunning. They needed to gather resources, to prepare for a long journey. The nearest town of any size was a week's ride away. They would need a horse, supplies, and most importantly, a head start. Elias began to subtly hoard supplies, a few extra biscuits from a stale loaf, a couple of salted strips of beef. He would hide them in a saddlebag, a little at a time, burying it under a loose floorboard in the bunkhouse. He mended a second bridle, an old half-rotten one he had found in the barn, reinforcing it with new leather. He worked with a renewed sense of purpose, his hands no longer moving in a resigned rhythm, but with a fierce, controlled energy. Eleanor, meanwhile, was the master of diversion. She would keep Silas busy, feigning interest in his stories of prosperity, asking him to ride to town, to buy her some fabric, anything to get him out of the cabin and off the ranch for a few hours. She would spend her days pretending to clean, her movements slow and deliberate, all the while taking mental notes of the ranch's layout, the times Silas would be away, the location of the best horse. One evening, Silas, drunk and belligerent, tried to force his attentions on her. Eleanor, with a strength he had not expected, pushed him away. "Do not touch me, Silas," she said, her voice cold with disgust. "Not until you show me some respect." You are not my husband, and you will not treat me as your property." Silas, stunned by her defiance, backed away. He was not used to a woman who stood her ground. He had expected a simpering, grateful wife. Instead, he had found a force of nature. He stormed out, slamming the door. Elias, hearing the noise, came to the cabin door. Eleanor, her face pale but her eyes still defiant, shook her head. "I'm fine," she mouthed. He nodded, a new respect burning in his gaze. He realized then that she wasn't just a partner in a plan. She was a warrior in her own right. Their escape was planned for a night a week later, when a full moon would provide enough light to see by, but not so much that they would be easily spotted. Elias had found two of Silas's best horses, a strong gelding and a sturdy mare, and had been secretly feeding them extra oats to get them in prime condition. The night before the escape, Eleanor came to the bunkhouse. Elias was startled, but she held up a hand. She had a small satchel in her hand. "I took a little from his safe," she whispered. "A few coins, enough to get us started." Elias looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Eleanor, this is a risk." "We're already risking everything, Elias," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "But this is a different kind of risk. This is a risk for a future. It's worth it." She reached out and touched his hand. "We'll leave everything behind, everything he took from you. We'll start new, a new life, just us." Elias looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes. For the first time in a decade, he saw a path forward, a way out of the darkness that had consumed him. He was no longer just Elias the scapegoat. He was Elias, a man with a partner, a man with a future. He was a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The night of the escape was a tense, moonlit affair. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome change from the day's oppressive heat. Elias, his heart thudding a nervous rhythm against his ribs, waited outside the bunkhouse, a saddlebag full of supplies slung over his shoulder. Eleanor, dressed in simple riding clothes, slipped out of the main cabin, a second bag in her hand. They moved like ghosts, their steps silent on the packed earth. Elias had already saddled the horses and had them tethered in a small hidden gully a few hundred yards from the ranch. They mounted in silence, the creak of the leather saddles the only sound. "Ready?" Elias whispered. "As I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, a ghost of a smile on her face. They rode out into the night, leaving the ranch behind them, a dark, silent shadow against the horizon. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, a heady mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking back, he was looking forward. Their journey was grueling. They rode for days, sleeping under the stars, eating the meager rations they had saved. They skirted around towns, avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize them or Silas's horses. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a testament to the raw power of nature. They faced dust storms, scorching sun, and nights where the wind howled like a hungry wolf. But with each passing mile, something shifted between them. The initial bond of mutual need began to deepen. They talked, not about their pasts, but about their dreams for the future. Elias, once a man of few words, opened up to Eleanor, sharing stories of his childhood, of his time in the army, and of his deep, abiding love for Clara. He confessed his fear of being a failure, of being a man who could not provide a legacy. Eleanor listened patiently, her own stories of a life on the East Coast, of a husband she had loved and lost, of her quiet resilience in the face of grief. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply listened, and in her listening, she offered him the gift of understanding, of being truly seen. One night, sitting by a small campfire, Elias looked at her. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice raw with emotion, for everything." Eleanor looked up from the fire. "We're in this together, Elias. I meant what I said. You need me in your bed, not for what Silas thinks, but for what we can build. A new life, a partnership." Elias nodded. He understood. It was a union not of physical love, but of emotional and spiritual connection, a promise to face the world together as equals, a promise to build a future out of the ashes of their pasts. They arrived in the town of Harmony, a small but bustling town with a rail line and a reputation for being a place of new beginnings. They sold one of the horses and found a small boarding house. It was a new world, a place where they were no longer defined by their pasts. They were just Elias and Eleanor, two people starting over. Harmony was a stark contrast to redemption. The streets were filled with the lively chatter of merchants, the clatter of wagons, and the distant whistle of a train. Elias and Eleanor, now a well-practiced couple in the art of pretense, rented a small room above a general store. They introduced themselves as a traveling couple looking for work. The money from the horse sale was a small cushion, but it wouldn't last forever. Elias found work at the blacksmith shop, his calloused hands proving their worth with every clang of the hammer. He was strong, reliable, and more importantly, he was good at what he did. His new employer, a gruff but fair man named Jedediah, saw his work ethic and offered him a steady wage. Eleanor, with her sharp mind and knack for organization, found work at the general store, helping the owner with bookkeeping and inventory. She had a way with people, a quiet charm that put customers at ease. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. Their nights were spent in their small room, talking about their days, sharing their hopes and fears. The pretense of a married couple began to fade, replaced by a deep and genuine bond. They were a team, a quiet force against the world. They were no longer just two people running from a past. They were two people building a future. Elias, for the first time, felt the weight of Silas's cruelty lift from his shoulders. The physical bruises had long since faded, but the emotional ones had been a constant ache. Now, surrounded by people who saw him for his worth, not his past, he began to heal. He found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile. He found joy in the simple things, the clang of his hammer, a good meal, and most importantly, Eleanor's company. Eleanor, too, was blossoming. The fear that had been her constant companion in redemption began to recede. She felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. Elias was a silent protector, a man of quiet strength who would never harm her. Their small room was a sanctuary, a place where she could finally let her guard down. One evening, as they sat by the window, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the room, Elias looked at Eleanor. "You were right," he said softly. "You needed me to get out of there, but I needed you too, more than you know." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes soft with emotion. "We both rescued each other, Elias," she said. "We just didn't realize it at the time. They were two broken pieces, but in harmony they were beginning to mend, not into their old selves, but into something new and stronger, a testament to the power of human connection and the resilience of the human spirit. Their peace in harmony was short-lived. A week after they arrived, Elias saw a familiar, imposing figure. Silas. A wave of cold fear washed over him. Silas had found them. Elias rushed to warn Eleanor, his mind racing. "He's here," he whispered. "We have to leave now." But Eleanor's strength was a roaring torrent. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We're not running anymore. We fought for this. We'll face him." They decided to confront Silas, using the law to protect themselves. But when they arrived at the sheriff's office, Silas was already there, spinning a web of lies, claiming Elias was a thief and Eleanor a con artist. The sheriff, a grizzled man with a skeptical eye, listened to both sides. "I don't know who's telling the truth," he said, "but I do know this. A thief runs. A man with a conscience faces his accuser." The sheriff saw the truth in Elias's worn hands and Eleanor's steady gaze. He saw Silas's calculated rage. "Last I checked, a man can't own another man, Silas," he said, his voice hardening. "You leave these people be and leave harmony, or I'll have a cell with your name on it." Defeated, Silas glared at them one last time before stomping out of the office, his power over them finally gone. Silas left Harmony the next day, a defeated and bitter man. His rage, once a fire that consumed everything, was finally extinguished. Elias and Eleanor were safe. The town of Harmony welcomed them, offering Elias a permanent position at the blacksmith shop and Eleanor a partnership at the general store. For the first time, Elias felt a sense of belonging. The guilt he had carried for so long began to heal. He was no longer the barren mule. He was Elias, the blacksmith, a man of honor and strength. Eleanor, too, found a peace she had long been searching for. Their relationship, which had started as a desperate alliance, blossomed into something beautiful and profound, a love built on shared trauma and unwavering support. One evening, Elias asked Eleanor to marry him for real, not out of need, but out of love. "I want that too, Elias," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. Their marriage was a quiet ceremony in the town church. There was no grand celebration, just the two of them promising to be each other's home. Elias knew he had found more than a partner. He had found a woman who had given him back his life. Years passed. Elias and Eleanor became fixtures in Harmony, their home a place of warmth and laughter. Their legacy was not one of blood, but of kindness and resilience. Without children of their own, they adopted an orphan boy named Thomas. Elias, once told he was useless, became a loving father, teaching Thomas how to be a good and honest man. Their love story became a legend in Harmony, a quiet testament that love could be found in the most unexpected places. One day, years later, Elias sat on his porch with Eleanor, watching Thomas in the garden. "That night you said you needed me in your bed," Elias said. "It was the first time I felt like I had a purpose. It was the moment I stopped being a victim." Eleanor smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "And it was the moment I found my home, Elias." Their story was a drama, not a fantasy, a story of a man who found his dignity and a woman who found her strength, not in miracles, but in the simple, profound act of caring for another human being. It was the true meaning of rescue, of two souls finding their way back to the light, together.